Welcome, Dr. Shah. He is the president of the Tucson Unified School District Governing Board, now in his third year of service to our community. He is a proud TUSD parent with 3 young children enrolled in TUSD and is a product of public education. Before being elected to the TUSD Governing Board in 2020, he served as a member of the TUSD Audit Committee and the TUSD Family Life Curriculum Committee, and as treasurer of his oldest daughter's school PTO. He will be speaking about his experience and ambitions leading TUSD and the newest developments regarding public education in Arizona. Let's give him a warm Democrats of Greater Tucson welcome. The floor is yours, Dr. Shah.
Well, thank you, Joseph, and thank you for having me this afternoon. I'm so excited to talk about our schools and public education and the work that we're doing both in TUSD as well as regionally to really help promote public education and to make sure we have a citizenry here in Southern Arizona ready for the future and whatever that might be. And so as Joseph said, I'm currently the president of our TUSD governing board in my second month of that right now. This is my third year as a TUSD governing board member, was elected in 2020. And so I've had a lot to learn coming on board 2 years ago. And it's been a really challenging and interesting couple of years. When we came in 2021 January, starting our term, the schools were still closed for in-person learning at that time here in TUSD. We were trying to figure out, with enrollment losses, and how that's going to balance with the funding coming in from COVID relief funds. At that point, ARPA hadn't passed yet, the American Rescue Plan Act. And so we didn't know where we were going to stand financially. And a lot of challenges were happening. And so, it's been a really interesting couple of years. In that first year, we opened our schools, we addressed school safety and needs as we continue to hear about tragic events around the country. We have really put some investment into music and arts and physical education and after school activities, as well as supporting, a lot of the labor shortages that we're facing throughout our entire country, especially when it comes to bus drivers and other staff shortages. So it's been a really amazing 2 years, and I'm excited about where we are today and the work that we're going to be doing over the course of these next 2 years here on the TUSD Governing Board. So in the chat, there's a question about presentation. I didn't have a presentation. I wasn't sure if you wanted just to sit through a slide deck or have this be more interactive and answer questions that people have. And I can talk about a couple of particular topics that we're addressing in the school board, Joseph, or what you think would be best, to help the audience really get a sense of what we're doing in TUSD.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Shah. Our flow is real simple. We recommend 20, 30 minutes if you need it of you basically presenting, and then there'll be questions from all the folks.
Yep.
And they'll raise their hand electronically, or they'll put the question in the chat room, and Mike Bryan will manage the questions. Mike, if you would be so kind.
Got it.
So how's that sound?
That sounds perfect. I can talk about a couple of the key topics that we're addressing right now. One of them that you oftentimes will hear a lot about in the last couple of weeks is our cybersecurity issue. So I'll address that. I'm sure that's an elephant in the room just to kind of tackle. It's true that 2 weeks ago, TUSD was attacked by a ransomware agency, one that's not based in the U.S. from what we understand. And they attacked our systems. They were able to infiltrate our systems, shut down a number of our networks and online interfaces that we had. And we were able to work with some cybersecurity experts from Microsoft and Cisco and others who have been taking over the process in terms of trying to fight back against the ransomware folks and try to re-access our systems, which we were able to do earlier last week, and really evaluate if there's any damage that was done. And the good news is that throughout the entire process, we were able to keep our schools open. None of our schools shut down. Kids were in school learning, and it might have been on paper and pen back how we all learned back in our childhood. But and so the technology was off for a week or two, but everything is back up and running now, which is great. From what we understand, none of our central servers were affected. All of those were secure and no data was extracted, any personal data on students, addresses, grades, discipline, or on our employees and staff, bank information, social security numbers, and other things. None of that was taken from our central servers. So we think all that was secure as of the information we have last time I was updated on this. There might have been some local data from individual staff members, district issued laptops or computer hard drives that might have been compromised, and we're trying to understand exactly what is missing or what is going on there. So that's still a work in progress. And I know there's been some issues about TUSD not really talking too much about it, but I hope everyone understands this was a very active issue that we were in continued attack. And we had cybersecurity experts on the back end doing negotiations, doing counterattack measures to try to figure out how to circumvent a lot of what was done to the district. So that was really a kind of a work in progress. And what I hope happens, it's still a work in progress. There's another email that came out, I think, end of last week from the ransomware. They're still trying to phish, phish, sending fake emails to staff members to try to gain access to our systems. So they're still working actively to try to infiltrate more of TUSD systems. So that's still a work in progress. We're still putting in firewalls and other things in place to support our infrastructure, our cybersecurity infrastructure against these hackers. And I hope that we'll be through this process in the next days or weeks ahead. Again, working to see, coming to the governing board and the staff in a couple of weeks or months, once we're through this, a really good process to understand what happened. As a physician, we do M&Ms, and we did M&Ms growing up in medical school and residency, and as a practice physician, morbidity, and mortality conferences to really dissect issues when they happen, bad outcomes with patients, not looking for blame, not looking to really attack anybody, but really trying to understand what happened, why it happened, what systems were in place and weren't in place that led to those bad outcomes for our patients. And so I hope to implement something in TUSD and have an M&M come to us in a couple of months to really evaluate what happened, why it happened, what was done following recommendations a few years ago on our cybersecurity systems, and what needs to still happen, and how much it's going to cost to really bring our systems up to the latest safe standards, which can be expensive. I've heard of last price check, if we were to go to the cloud for all of our systems, which is, I think, the most secure versions that I've heard, that might be up to $3 million of capital funding, which is a challenge in the current budget that we have. So we really see what's going to be worth it, what's not just putting window dressing on things, and really actually making an impact to keep our systems secure. So it's one big issue that I know our staff has been dealing with a lot over these last 2 weeks, and is making a lot of media attention, but I hope that we are on the other side of this really soon. The other big issue, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about this coming up, is, I mentioned capital funding and our capital budget. We have a limited capital budget, and our capital funding is down. I think it's either $160 or $180 million if we didn't have the budget cuts of 2009 that we did from the state of Arizona. So over the last 14 years now, we would have had an additional $160+ million coming into our district just to help support capital needs of our district. And I know a lot of you are retired teachers or active, volunteers or substitute teachers or other folks in our classrooms, from having interacted with many of you over the years. And you've seen our classrooms, you've seen our schools, and know that a lot of them are in need for significant repair. Our average age of our buildings is over 50 years. And so we have some classrooms and some buildings that are up to 100 years plus old, some that are newer, but we have an average age of 50 years and over 8 million square feet of space that needs to be updated, a lot of it. And when we had a meeting with our capital team and our operations team, looking at just getting us up to minimal acceptable standards of our IT infrastructure, our bus fleets, our buildings and HVAC systems, redoing some of the bathrooms that are falling apart, and so many of the other facilities that really need just minimal repair, let alone actually getting to nice, presentable, fancy, updated standards that we see in our competitive districts. That cost was over $450 million. And so we're going to see, what is the best way is, can we can we ask our voters for a bond on this? Because we know that our schools really need the funding to really update our schools. And just a personal touch, I remember, when I was PTA treasurer of my daughter's when she was a kindergartner in Miles, being PTA treasurer, I spent a lot of time on campus, just managing checks and taking care of a few things, a couple of mornings a month, and just knowing, just having used the bathrooms myself, just how they were falling apart, just the standard bathrooms throughout that campus. My daughter's at Lineweaver now, and even my little toddlers were in her school going to one of her events and commented on the floors really being falling apart and cracking, and all the other things that they noticed, at 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, that we've learned to ignore as adults and kids in the classrooms. So we know we need a lot of work in our schools, and so we're going to be exploring over the next couple of months what it would mean to go to a bond. The last time a bond or override was passed in TUSD, I believe, was 2004. So it's been almost 20 years. What that would mean, what that would entail, what do people want in our community who are voting this year in terms of what they want for their school and their school community. So we're hoping that all of our 80 plus campuses are affected positively by this. And so that's a process that we're going to explore over these next few months, and come back to us as a governing board to make a decision on whether to go out for a bond this fall. So there's some big issues. I know there's a number of other issues, and I know there's some questions out there. I saw some hands go up, and so I think, Michael, you're managing any kind of questions that come through the queue, and so I can stop there and answer a few questions on these topics. Or
well, there was one main question: is did we have to pay any money in ransom for the ransomware attack?
All right, so right now, everything has been through our insurance, what we call the trust. So we are insured for events like this. And so they've been managing everything. And so the cybersecurity, from what I understand and what I've been told, all the cybersecurity experts and everything that have been employed throughout this process have been funded by the trust. Now, the trust won't pay for any upgrades of our system. So the $3 million that I mentioned that I've heard is a potential cost that will be covered by the trust. That'll be on our own to update our systems. But everything so far, from what I understand, has been covered by our insurance.
Great.
So Lucy Messing, you have a question.
Thank you. Hi, Ravi. Great to see you. I have a question about school councils, because it seems like they were strong at one time, and now they don't seem to be as popular as they used to be, even though it is a state law that every school is supposed to have an operating school council. Can you share any information about that with me?
Right. I think some of it is, COVID related, but we don't want to just blame COVID for everything. When I was a PTA treasurer, this was back in 2016, 17 school year, maybe, or 17, 18 school year, right, well before COVID, the PTA meetings would follow the site council meetings at the elementary, the K-8 school that my daughter was at. And the site council was, it was very challenging to get people to come to the site council even back then before COVID, let alone our PTA meetings, which, it was just our officers that were usually attending those meetings. And so, one of the big things that we need to do better about as a district is engaging parents in the community to really be involved more, whether it's educating on tax credit money, which I'm sure everyone in DGT is well aware of, and hopefully you're giving to your local school or grandkids school or child's school if you have someone in the school district. But all of you probably know about the tax credit funds coming through, but also being involved on site councils and PTAs and other organizations in your community, because it is so hard to recruit. It's a lot of tireless work just to raise money or being part of the decisions or coming to those monthly or quarterly meetings. But even before COVID, I know there's been a real struggle to get people involved on site councils and PTAs. And when I talk to teachers and look at the data, family engagement is one of the most protective things and most important things for student success. I'll kind of take a diversion, kind of a statement here, Lucy, and that's where you were getting to. But one thing that the Budget Advisory Committee has been looking at is literacy. So we formed the Budget Advisory Committee as one of my first things I did coming onto the school board 2 years ago to really look at evidence-based interventions for our district. Getting some smart people in the room, well smarter than I am, and that we can really address and look at issues. We looked at classroom sizes. We've looked at the minimum wage and what it means in terms of long-term and short-term impacts at TUSD. And this past year in the Budget Advisory Committee, we looked at literacy. A lot of comments on libraries and librarians and books and how to address literacy. That comes up in all of our discussions of academic achievement. And we can't be successful in science or social studies or any others, or even math, if our students can't read, at grade level. And so we looked at literacy, and it was so simple. And I was surprised how simple it was. It wasn't anything fancy in terms of the evidence out there to address literacy. It was professional development and coaches for our teachers. It was getting families engaged, small group instruction. A lot of these simple things, that we are doing and need to do better. But family engagement was part of it. And when I talked to teachers, I went to 6 schools last week, and a lot of them were schools in low-income communities that were struggling. And I hear over and over again the literacy coaches and teachers just wishing they can engage parents and families a lot more. And so working in your community, coming to site council meetings, trying to engage the families in these different organizations is going to be so important for sustainable district success and the academic achievement for our students. Is all linked together.
Great. We have a question from Susie.
Hi, Dr. Shah. It's so good to see you again.
Mhm.
As a physician educator, what is your response to those who honestly say closing schools during the pandemic was a bad thing for students? Was there something else that might have been done? I mean, I look at it like, that was a public health issue. Yeah, and I recognize that it put kids behind, but what else? Is there anything else we could have done?
Well, thank you for that. And so I kind of skipped into going into the school district without talking too much of my background. So I'm a family physician by trade. Did most of my training in Chicago, where I'm originally from. Worked in the Cook County health system, so worked in underserved medicine for all of my career in the Cook County health system, as well as federally qualified health centers, community health centers in Chicago and here in Tucson. I spent about 6 years working in the U of A Banner system. So as Susie mentioned, a physician educator, worked mostly with residents, but some with medical students, seeing patients, teaching. I was delivering babies up until 2 years ago, so kind of full spectrum family medicine. Left clinical medicine for 2 years to work in the nonprofit sector. So I worked at SAFE. I was the CEO of SAFE, the Southern Arizona AIDS Foundation, for almost 2 years. And then went back into clinical medicine last year, and I'm seeing patients mostly at El Rio right now. So most of you should be familiar with El Rio and the great work that they're doing here. It's still a live process. I saw more respiratory illness, positive flu, and COVID cases in December, in the first 21 days in December, that I had in the previous 21 years of my career as a physician and resident medical student. So it's still a rampant issue in respiratory illness. And it's true, I see it with my own daughter. She was a 3rd grader when schools were closed, and she was a 2nd grader when schools were closed. She did her whole 3rd year of 3rd grader year as a remote, almost all of it remote. And she's not someone who really learned well remotely. And I saw the learning loss that she faced, having a physician parent as well as another parent, her other father, who was an educator and was a TUSD principal for his career as well. We struggle to support her. And so we see learning loss. We see a lot of the negative effects of our students that we're still catching up with. But we also know the consequences of not having our schools closed. Our teachers, our staff, our folks that our students come home to. My father lives with us. He's in his mid-70s right now, making sure that he stayed safe during that COVID year. And we saw what happened last year in January when Omicron started, and so many classrooms were closed and so many issues were happening in our schools. And so I think all of our districts around the country were stuck between a rock and a hard place. How to keep our schools open safely, how to keep social distancing, how to keep students learning, and how to keep our teachers, staff safe, how to keep our classes open when everyone was getting sick. And I don't think there was a best answer at that point. And I wasn't part of that decision that closed the schools. I was part of the decision that reopened the schools in 2021 when I started my term. And I said, I don't fault anyone for decisions that were made. I think everyone's just doing the best they can in terms of trying to implement the best public health measures and data that we had at the time.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Steve Linder, you have a question.
I know that you pay a lot of attention to our marvelous state legislature and all the wonderful things they do. So I really have a 2-part question is, what do you see as the biggest threats that are coming out of the legislature involving public education during this session? And second part, how much do you think Governor Hobbs, and how much faith do you have that she will be able to stop or just veto whatever comes through, and and that will be our saving grace? How do you see this legislature year playing out?
Well, thank you, Steve, for that, and good to see you again. I am paying a lot less attention to the state legislature this year than in previous years. I know we have that veto ability if something were to pass that's bad. We've had some really bad legislation passed in the last couple of years, since I've been a school board member or involved in our school district, from how we're managing COVID and mandates that go against public health recommendations, to how we're working with marginalized students in our schools, especially those that are trans-identifying. And so there's been a lot of really bad bills over the years, and I feel pretty confident that Governor Hobbs is going to veto anything that does more harm than good for our schools, and I trust her to really evaluate that appropriately. She has the right people around her, which is great. I was lucky enough to join Lucy and a bunch of other of you here down in Springfield, or excuse me, out in Phoenix, got my Chicago hat back on for a second, to see the State of the Union address that Governor Hobbs did. First thing she mentioned was education. And she spent a lot of time talking about education. And so we know we have a really public school education strong governor who's going to really pay attention. We passed what I believe was a clean AEL bill last week. So our aggregated expenditure limit is addressed for this year. And they weren't able to tack on any poison pills, which was great. So that's good. I think the big question is, what Governor Hobbs is going to be able to negotiate for the budget on our regular maintenance operations, on our capital expenditure and other pieces of our school budgets. And I hope that she can really, twist the arms of the other party, which is still in the majority in both the state house and the Senate by, I think, one seat in each chamber, and really help support a lot more funding for our public schools while vetoing any of the poison bills that they're just still trying to pass on the state level.
Okay, Lee Older has a question.
Hi, everybody. I'm an avid NPR listener, and I hear Andrea a lot. But yesterday morning, you can catch these again on the repeats. There was a wonderful program on NPR about teaching reading and how it doesn't work sometimes, and how a lot of times it doesn't work. I don't know if any of you heard that, but it would be worth a listen if you can. And then this morning on the 9 o'clock program, there was another a call-in from a Tucson educator who was discussing what you were just talking about, how the legislature and charter schools and all of that were just decimating our public school system. And if you're interested in either of those programs, you can look them up again on NPR and hear them maybe tonight even. So I thought they were both very interesting, and that they were both about teaching reading, which is so important, because if you can't read, you can't do much else. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, well, Mike, I think we have some questions in the chat room.
So we have a question about, it seems that our SPI, Mr. Horn, has decided to spend some mental health resources on armed guards for all the schools. I'm wondering about getting your thoughts about that move.
Yeah, it's really just interesting, hearing a lot was coming out of the Department of Education over the last couple of weeks. I feel like he's not going to the same schools I'm going to and seeing, the same things I'm seeing. So just last week, I mentioned I went to 6 schools. It's Love and Reading, February is Love of Reading. And so I've taken the opportunity when I'm not in clinic seeing patients or with my kids doing things with them to get into our schools. And I had a great fortune to go to 6 schools last week. 5 of them were elementary schools and 1 was a middle school. In one of those schools, there was a student, one of the elementary schools, there was a student on a beanbag sleeping in the principal's office because he was so dysregulated. And a lot of, just this psychosocial issues and needs. And we heard the term, ACEs a lot, adverse childhood events. We've been talking about it in the medical world, for the last couple of years, and how that affects health outcomes. And we know how that affects student outcomes. On education as well. He was on the floor sleeping in the principal's office. And that was not the first time in my couple of years of touring schools that I saw students sleeping in the principal's office. That's the only safe space that they can be safe and the other students can be safe as well. At another school, this was a different school. We said hi to the school counselor, and as we were leaving, the principal was talking briefly to the school counselor about they were surprised that a student had showed up at school because they was clutching the picture of his father who was just incarcerated the weekend before, and they were surprised that he even came to school, and what they can actually do for him in class, what was going to be able to focus on. Every single school there were issues like that. Students time and time again that are really struggling, and to say that social emotional learning is a farce and not important, like that's the base of what we need to do before we can even address academic achievement. If a student is so heartbroken that their father was incarcerated the previous weekend, or just dysregulated, or have all these other effects of the trauma and what happens with poverty and so many other things, we can't even begin to start teaching them to read and write if they can't focus on that. We know that in medicine, like I'm not going to be able to get my patient's A1Cs down if we don't address their depression and anxiety and other things first. And we know that in medicine. We've recognized that many years ago. And same thing as in education. We know that we can't teach reading, arithmetic, and writing unless we address all the other stuff. So I'm just flabbergasted that if he's not going to the same school, seeing the same things I'm seeing. But that's in almost every single school in TUSD I go to, something like this comes up. And specifically to the officers in our schools. That's a great talking point. It just doesn't it sound so right? We have school shootings, let's get more armed security guards in our school. That's going to protect our kids. That sounds like the right answer, doesn't it? But it's not. It's so not the right answer. If you look at the actual data, you look at studies, people in the social sciences are looking at all the school shootings since the 1990s and looking at see, whether there were security officers or other people on our campuses, and they've seen no added value or benefit. There was no less murders or deaths. There was no less, poor outcomes on the schools that had armed security guards and those that didn't. So they don't make a difference. The evidence doesn't support that they make a difference, but there's so much evidence out there that having armed security guards harms, especially students of color and other individuals on our campuses. So when the evidence shows that it doesn't help, but it actually harms, to keep on touting this is, this happens all the time when you talk to, our Republican counterparts. They're always touting things that have so much evidence against what they're saying, but they keep on ignoring that. And, when I ran for office as a physician, one of the big things I ran on was, applying the evidence to the work that we're doing. And so when we have these issues, when we have school shootings, when we have learning loss, when we have classroom sizes, I've been really focused on making sure, what does the evidence show? What are the people that are smarter than even the group of people in TUSD, the national data, the people that are doing these studies? What can they bring to the table that we know to really apply to best practices here in TUSD? And something like school officers, I'll admit, I voted for the SRO program back 2 years ago when it didn't cost us anything. The city of Tucson and the sheriff's office and Pima County was covering almost all of the costs. And so I voted for it. But since then, I have seen a lot of data and a lot of things come up, especially after the Uvalde shooting. I voted against the package that came to us back in July as a response to Uvalde because I didn't feel it was evidence-based. I felt it was just reactionary without really improving outcomes for our schools. And I no longer support having armed officers in our schools based on the data and evidence that I've seen.
Thank you, Doctor. We've gotten a couple of questions about private schools, specifically charter schools and vouchers, and how for private schools, and how those programs are affecting and chipping away at the foundation of public education here in Arizona. Can you address those two programs and how you see that harming your board and your district?
Well, first of all, I think all of us can agree that no public fund should go anywhere that doesn't have the same public standards. We're not testing, if we're not evaluating, charter schools in the same way we are our public schools. The reason we do that so much, the reason we have school letter grades, the reason we have, testing, the reason we have all these curriculum requirements is because we believe those are best practices to help, help our students learn and grow, and to help families really evaluate our schools. But our charter schools, our private schools, and definitely our home schools are not at all subject to any of the same standards. And so no public money should be going to any school that's not subject to the same public standards that our public schools are, in my opinion. And we know that, yes, there's a lot of money being siphoned off. A lot of students are going to charter schools or, home schools or other kinds of, facilities, and we don't know what's happening to them. We don't know if they're learning and growing in those environments. And I think that's unfortunate.
Thank you, Doctor.
Well, I have a question. Dr. Shah, I was at a gathering and I was talking to a private school principal. And she said there was still a big gap between what the private school's getting and what the public school's getting from the state. And she mentioned some numbers, and I told her I never heard those numbers before. So can you elucidate what the numbers are?
I'm not privy to all the numbers going to charter schools, so I can't really speak to those. But having talked to a lot of parents and other folks and seen some of the resources, my ex-spouse, after leaving TUSD, he worked at a charter school for a few years before leaving education to be working a consultant, and so got to see the resource they have. First of all, our private schools and charter schools aren't open to all the students. I think technically they are, but we all know they really aren't. TUSD and our public schools take every student, regardless of their background, regardless of their socioeconomic need, regardless of their behavioral needs. And because of that, we have the resources a lot of other schools don't have. We have the reading coaches and interventionists. We have the MTSS coordinators that are working with students that need some further interventions. We have the counselors and behavioralists that we need and that require a lot of money because we're dealing with some of the most challenging students in our district, in our region, that the private and charter schools, get to say aren't good fits for their school. That we don't want to say that we wouldn't. That's not our point of public schools. We welcome every student, not because we have to, but because that's the point of public schools. We welcome every student, regardless of their needs, and we find a way to meet their needs with the resource that we have. And if we have more resources, that's great because we know we need them for the high needs populations that we're serving.
Yeah, thanks so much, and salute you for all your hard work and efforts. Susie, you have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Shah, do we have now enough counselors, or are we still behind on what the needs are? With them raising the cap, is that part of the money that we can use for more counselors and people to work with the kids that are struggling? I know I'm a reading seed coach and I love those kids and have so much fun, and it really works, that program. So, I'm not going to quit that program as long as I can. But what about, the counselors in the schools? Do we have enough?
Right. So I don't know if we'll ever have enough counselors for the need that we have in our schools. As a family physician, I take care of a lot of kids, and most of the kids I take care of have Medicaid, state access. And there are just not the resources in our community, not enough individuals in the mental health space accepting access for pediatric mental health needs. There just isn't. And so I struggle as a physician to find resources for my kid patients, my pediatric patients that need their depression, anxiety, their trauma addressed, their behavioral issues addressed that are affecting more than the school environment. So it's a huge need in our community, let alone in our schools. I think the recommended ratio is 350 to 1, something like that, from the National School Counselors Associations. And as someone put in the chart, Lucy did in the chat, we're at 700 students per counselor right now. So we need a lot more. And I know we're a lot better now than we were even a few years ago. And a lot of that's because of the funding we were able to do with Title I, and of course our ESSER money, which is our COVID relief money, which is going to be going away in 2024. And so we're working on finding other sources of funding, moving more of these positions on the Title I, now that we have more control of our DSEG funding, whether that can help meet the needs, especially of our marginalized and minority students. So we're looking at other sources of funding to keep that ratio at least where it is, if not improve it. And so it's definitely better than it was a few years ago, but I would love to be able to get better ratios, because our students, like we said earlier, social emotional learning is so important. Our students aren't going to be able to be ready to read and learn if they're dealing with trauma and other things that are unmet needs for them. Maybe better for the last, but I'll just say this right now. I'd love for all of you to get involved as much as you can with our schools. Some of you are in our schools, whether you're in Marana, like Sioux Heck, or in whatever district you're part of, get involved. We're going to be talking this Thursday at our next school board meeting about our committees and the work that they're doing. We're really struggling to recruit people into our committees to really give that community perspective and to help the governing board, make better decisions for the work that we are doing. And so TUSD, if you Google TUSD Governing Board, there's a subsection on committees. You can learn more about, especially the audit committee. We'll see if we continue the technology committee, but there's other committees that we definitely need community support on. Get involved in your site councils, getting involved in other ways. Just ask your local school like how you can get involved. And there's so many ways that you can help and volunteer and support the work that's being done on our campuses.
I do have a question. Nurses make $3,000 less a year than teachers do because years ago under Superintendent Sanchez, they were moved to a lower paying pay scale. And that's what we pay nurses wasn't competitive even when we paid them what teachers do. Exact same thing was done to social workers. We have horrible shortages of nurses and social workers, and social workers make $2,000 less a year than teachers do. So what are you going to do about getting reasonable pay for nurses and social workers so we can hire enough to fill the need?
Well, thank you, Lillian. Good to see you again on the Zoom. We've done a lot over the last year on pay in our district. We have brought everyone, last summer, we brought everyone to a $15 minimum wage earlier than we had originally targeted to do so, thanks to all of your advocacy in this group to help really push some more funding from the state legislature last summer that passed last minute. So we really raised everyone. We've addressed a lot of subgroups of our staff, including our bus drivers, which has been a big issue, making sure we have the transportation staff in place. We're looking at other groups of staff members. We have looked at other groups of staff members that have that we compete with on the non-school sector. So we have a lot of groups that we compete with other school districts, and I think we're competitive on those. We've raised our substitute teacher pay. We've raised a lot of other pay there on those fronts. But we looked specifically at a lot of our workforce that we're not just competing against with other school districts, but competing against the private sector, our HVAC staff, our ground staff, and as well as our social workers and other folks that oftentimes are working outside the school and education system. So we've targeted. Go ahead, Lily.
Excuse me, nothing was done about social workers and nurses. Their pay was not raised. It's been $2,000 less than teachers for many years for social workers and $3,000 a year less for nurses for many years. Their pay wasn't raised. I'm sorry.
Everyone got a pay raise. Everyone got 2 steps last year. Teachers and social workers and nurses, and everyone on or unionized did get pay raises. Not a single person was left out of the pay work that we were doing over the last year. And so we'll continue to look at pay raise. We'll continue to look at openings. We'll have to see, what are our most scarce staff resources and where are the most openings in our system. And that's some of the work that we've done over the year. The administration has come to us saying, here's where we have too many openings, on this group of workers. We're not being competitive against the private sector, and we have to do something differently. So we'll continue looking and seeing where the openings are in our system and where we need to continue to be more competitive beyond TUSD to make sure we're getting the best of everyone that we can in our system.
So I have another question in the chat. Carolyn Anderson wonders, is the legislature or the superintendent of public instruction got plans to attract more teachers? I know that the governor announced a commission to study the issue of teacher retention. I think I recall her saying, we don't have a recruitment problem, we have a retention problem. So do you have any insight into that or any thoughts about that?
Right. Governor Hobbs mentioned that in her State of the State address back in early January. And so she's really focused on making sure we address that. Unfortunately, however, I think a lot of what the state legislature and now the Department of Education under the new leadership is doing is complete opposite. They're driving teachers out of the profession with more regulation, more just bad bills that really attack, their ability to do the best that they can for our students. As we put in more regulations, they put in, more, right-wing bills that, try to subvert the teacher and student relationship. We're going to be driving more teachers out of the profession. And so I hope we can, obviously Governor Hobbs will veto a lot of it. I hope Mr. Horn, the damage that he can do is limited without having an attorney general that supports him and without having a governor that's going to pass the bills that he wants. So I hope that their harm is limited, but there has been a lot of harm done over the years. A lot of bad bills that, really attack teachers and the work that they're doing. And, we see that in a lot of these states, in Texas and Florida. I think, the triple, threat of Arizona, Texas, and Florida, and all the bad bills are doing on education and attacking that relationship that teachers have with students, is pretty, unfortunate. And I see these bad bills, and, and a lot of them are, to be blunt, attacking LGBTQ students and really attacking, teachers' relationship with LGBTQ students. And I believe in, parents have, rights. As a parent myself, I do believe my own rights I have as a parent, but, they're subverting this term of parental rights, and they've co-opted this term to really allow parents to spy on their students and use the schools to spy on their students, and use teachers to spy on their students against the students and teachers' will, which is sad and pathetic that we're allowing this. Every parent has the ability to form the relationship and create a safe space for their students. And I don't think it's parental rights to force teachers to, divulge confidential information that students are giving them about who they are and, the names they want to be called and other kinds of things. As someone, who's LGBTQ identifying myself, the first adult I told was my English teacher in high school. And, I'm so happy that I had, adult that I felt comfortable, sharing who I was and having that confidential space that I did as a, 15 or 16-year-old at the time. And, students need to have that safe space. And sometimes it's only the schools that's been created. And, just the state is doing everything they can in our state and so many other states to subvert that and to attack teachers for creating those safe spaces for their students. And that's unfortunate.
Okay, Lillian, do you have another question?
Yeah, I sure do. One of the things Dr. Trujillo did, which was really shocking, is he had every new teacher who was hired, every counselor, every nurse signed to just temporary contracts. And they got contracts, and he did this, and the contract said, this is your only notice that you do not have a job after this year. And then he notified all the principals towards the end of the year of who their teachers, nurses, and social workers who were on temporary contracts, and said, you can lay these people off. And so what that meant, since we were in declining enrollment, if principal had one more exceptional ed teacher than he needed, he just laid them off. Now, under the TEA contract, they should have been listed as a district initiated transfer. And then if he didn't need that exceptional ed teacher, they could have applied for any vacancies in the district. And if they got hired in a school that needed them, then they had a job. If there was no school that wanted them, then they were out of work. So my question to you, Dr. Ravi, is he still doing that? Because that's one of the reasons you have problems staffing, is schools lay off these people who are in scarce positions because they don't need them, because the TEA contract where they should have been a district initiated transfer and been allowed to apply for vacancies in other schools doesn't apply anymore. Is he still doing that?
Well, I think it's a combination of state law and our contracts. So any new teacher that comes into our district or a contracted person they're in the probationary, that's what I'm looking for. They're in the probationary period in the first year or longer on TUSD. And so for any teacher or staff member that is really excelling in our district, I think we're doing everything we can to keep them. And that probationary period is there for a reason. It's for those who aren't in the right fit as a profession, or aren't, are really struggling to excel as a teacher or as a staff member. That probationary period exists to make sure that our district can help them find other places that might be a better fit for them if it's not in our classrooms.
You're not, Dr. Ravi, you're not correct. I was a TEA rep, and that's simply not true. They've always been on probation for 3 years, but they've never been on temporary contracts where they could be fired without cause.
Well, I think that's the purpose of probation, is to make sure we have the best in our classrooms. And if someone, was lost a position, but there was a great performer and we wanted to keep them in the district, I know that the district's doing everything we can to keep those who we need in our schools.
No,
and our schools.
He's told them they can just lay them off. What you're saying is not correct, because I was a TEA rep. We've
okay. I think we're going to have to move along, and maybe Lillian, you and Dr. Shah can have a question offline. You know, I am so impressed today with the commitment we have and to education and TUSD and all the school districts in Southern Arizona. And the questions today have been wonderful. The chat room, there's lots of good points in there. So take some time and read the chat room. So thanks so much for being here today.
Say a quick thank you for everyone for listening, for being here, and for all of your work on democratic issues and public education. If the governing board does decide to go for a bond this fall, I know all of you will be working to elect the best, mayors and city councils we can, but please, all those efforts you did on Red for Ed and all the pushes you did on statewide initiatives, put that same energy into helping us pass that bond, because if we can transform all 80 some of our campus and update them, update our infrastructure, update our capital, that's going to pay dividends for our students for the next generation or two. So please, if we do end up deciding to go to the voters for a bond, please get involved and help get that passed.
Well, very well said, and we will. Yeah, let's give Dr. Shah a big round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr.
Really
Shah.
appreciate him today.